Hello, everybody. Welcome. Thanks for joining us. My name is Michael Burrows, and I serve as director of the Kegley Institute of Ethics here at California State University at Bakersfield. And on behalf of the Kegley Institute, thanks for joining us tonight for this Community Colloquia Series lecture with Dr. Amy Reed-Sandoval. I want to begin by thanking our supporting sponsors who make this and all of our programs possible: the Kegley family, Valley Strong Credit Union, Kaiser Permanente, and Adventist Health Bakersfield. And I also want to thank our CSUB IT team who is helping us with tonight's technology. Just a few brief notes on procedure for this evening's events before I introduce our speaker. So Dr. Reed-Sandoval will deliver her talk tonight titled Intimate Boundaries Toward a Feminist Theory of Borders. And following that, I'll moderate a question and answer session with all of you. So for your questions, you can feel free to submit them via the Q&A function at the bottom of your screen. And no, you can submit questions at any time. You don't need to wait till the end of the talk. If you'd like to get them in the queue early or something strikes your mind, feel free to put a question in there and I'll make note of it. And I'll do my best to get to as many of those questions as possible. With that, I'm honored to introduce our guest tonight. So our guest, Dr. Amy Reed-Sandoval, is Assistant Professor of Philosophy and affiliated faculty in the Latinx and Latin American Studies program at the University of Nevada, Las Vegas. She is the author of the book Socially Undocumented: Identity and Immigration Justice, which was published by Oxford University Press in 2020. And she's also co-editor of Latin American Immigration Ethics. She's currently at work on a new book that is tentatively entitled Intimate Borders: Feminism at the Boundaries of the State. She's also the practitioner of pre-college philosophy, or sometimes we call it philosophy for children, and has founded and developed philosophy for children programs in Oaxaca, Mexico, and at the U.S. Mexico border in El Paso, Texas, and Ciudad Juarez, Mexico, and most recently in Las Vegas, Nevada. With that, Dr. Reed-Sandoval, I just want to say thank you so much for joining us, and I'll turn it over to you for your talk.
Wonderful. Thank you so much, Michael. Thank you to everyone who's tuned in today. I really appreciate your presence and look forward to discussion with you in the Q&A. And of course, thank you for the Kegley Institute of Ethics for hosting me as well. So I'm going to go ahead and share my screen. Please do bear with me as I do this. Let's see, just one moment. All right, hopefully everyone can see that. So yes, as Michael mentioned, the title of my talk today is Intimate Boundaries Toward a Feminist Theory of Borders. And this is a work in progress, again, from my in progress book that Michael kindly mentioned. So I wanted to start out by talking actually a little bit about Ukraine. I was not planning on talking about this today, but an article, I read an article in The Atlantic this morning that really illustrates the kind of philosophical challenge that I'm trying to kind of work on in this book and also in today's talk. So I'm going to add a little bit and just talk about it because obviously the Ukraine situation is on so many of our minds. So some of you may have seen this article. I tweeted it this morning. Ukraine's surrogacy industry has put women in impossible positions, written by Alison Motluck. And so just to kind of add a little bit about this article, it's a really worthwhile read. But as the author explores, Ukraine is a place in which surrogacy contracts are legal. So many Ukrainian women, people, earn money through gestating babies, fetuses of parents who live in other countries. And often this involves certain types of control of their movement, right? And so in a surrogacy contract, it's legal for the parents, the biological parents, to stipulate that the surrogate live close to the clinic where she will give birth, right, within kind of a month, say a month or a couple of months of the planned due date, for example. So their movement is already being controlled. And so some Ukrainian women in rural areas had already migrated internally to urban areas where they would be able to give birth. But then as rumors, as word kind of got out that there was a possible invasion being planned by Russia, parents who had engaged in these contracts with surrogates started getting worried, right? And so then there was pressure on the surrogates to actually move once again, to relocate to another part of Ukraine that wasn't so vulnerable to attack. And so different Ukrainian women had different reactions to this. Some didn't want to uproot their families again. Some women wanted to stay and fight, right? And some did in fact uproot and have complicated feelings about that. And as Alison Motluk writes in The Atlantic, I have her quoted here, many people have jobs that force them to be separated from their families. Military personnel, diplomats, foreign correspondents, international nannies, home care workers. And in Ukraine, being a surrogate is not only a job, it is often a well-paid job. But most jobs you can quit or at least put on hold. This one you can't really. This one might keep you from your family or from acting on your sense of duty to your country. It might physically impede your ability to get to safety. It might require you to seek medical attention even as medics are overrun with the injured and dying, end quote. I wanted to briefly just signal this to you today, highlight this to you today, not because I'm going to be focusing on Ukraine in today's talk, but because in my view, there's a real, there's so many ethical challenges, right, present in this article and this theme. But in terms of what I'm thinking about in my book and in today's presentation, I believe that these stories raise ethical challenges in the realm of migration, and particularly in the realm of gender and migration, right? Because their movement is being coerced in certain ways, right? In this case, on the part of surrogates, right? It's being coerced, it's being forced. Certain types of bordering practices are being enacted, but these sorts of practices are not always visible to us in the way in which we talk about migration and the ethics of migration. So that's just a little brief kind of aside, but I wanted to indicate that today's presentation is, in my view, very much connected to current events. Okay, so let me talk now a little bit about my work attempting to develop a feminist theory of borders. So let's start talking about boundaries and borders philosophically, because when we think about boundaries and borders from a feminist perspective, things are kind of complicated. On the one hand, boundaries and borders can be beneficial, right? So that the pop psychologist Faith Harper, she wrote a book. It's called Unfuck Your Boundaries. Excuse me, I'm not sure if I'm allowed to drop the F-bomb, but she talks about the importance of personal boundaries and writes that boundaries are the constructs that differentiate between ourselves and someone else. Hannah Arendt has written about physical solitude, which is a type of solitude that Anita Allen describes as part of the family of privacy in terms of a contemplative and silent dialogue about myself with myself. And the political philosopher Michael Walzer has argued, kind of applying these considerations to the state. He's argued that to tear down the walls of the state is not to create a world without walls, but rather to create a world of petty fortresses. And that to then tear down these petty fortresses would create, quote, a world of radically deracinated men and women. Now, one might agree or disagree with Walzer, right? But as you can see, philosophers and other scholars and people have lots to say about ways in which borders and boundaries can help us. But on the other hand, boundaries and borders can be harmful, right? So first of all, boundaries and interpersonal relationships can be experienced as neglect, right? Just imagine a young child who is dependent on their caregiver, right? If the caregiver erects too many boundaries, that can in fact turn into neglect, something that's in fact unhealthy for the dependent child. Anita Allen has explained, alone at home with a good book is one thing, being quarantined on an island or tossed into a super maximum security prison cell, another. And Gloria Anzaldúa has argued, applying the kind of considerations of privacy and intimacy to borders, she described the U.S. Mexico border as una herida abierta, an open wound where the third world grates against the first and bleeds. And kind of this echoes in certain respects or anticipates the anthropologist Leo Chavez's claim that the U.S. Mexico border is a veritable spectacle in the desert in which Mexicans and other Latin Americans are surveilled on a massive scale. So with this kind of context in mind, let me just list my objectives for today's presentation. I want to argue today that many borders are unjust because they are sites of wrongful privacy violation, which is a kind of a different way of thinking about how borders and bordering practices might be harmful to people. And when I do this, I'm going to challenge the human-centeredness of the bulk of the privacy ethics literature. I'll talk about this some more in just a moment. And I'm going to argue that these privacy violations occur frequently and perniciously when those who experience them have relatively vulnerable social identities, including but not limited to women, gestating people, people of color, and children. And at the very end, I'll tentatively, very tentatively, and with hopes of kind of hearing your feedback and commentary on this, gesture toward a feminist theory of borders that rejects borders as sites of wrongful privacy violation, or in as much as they are sites of wrongful privacy violation, while also recognizing that borders and boundaries can play important roles in our lives, especially for women and other vulnerable groups, including vulnerable political communities. And just to offer a few words of clarification before I begin, in this particular presentation, when I say borders, I'm talking about national and internal, like state borders and surrounding borderlands. But in my book, I'm interested in expanding upon what counts as a border. So I won't get into that so much in today's presentation, but if this is something that you're interested in talking about, I'd love to chat about it with you in the Q&A. I'll also say that in today's presentation, I'm going to call upon ethnographic research that I conducted in the U.S. Mexico borderlands, right, in kind of in the realm of maternity and migration. So work that I did both at the U.S. Mexico border in El Paso, Texas, and Ciudad Juarez, Mexico, but also research that I conducted at a couple of abortion clinics in Albuquerque, New Mexico. And I know that this is likely kind of an interdisciplinary group, so hopefully many of you are kind of on board with that kind of approach to ethical work. I know for philosophers in the room, that might seem a little bit strange. I won't talk so much about my approach to doing ethnography as a philosopher in this presentation, but again, very happy to talk about it in the Q&A. And I'll also say that this argument is anchored in feminist philosophy, feminist conceptions of privacy, and there's also engagement here with Chicana, Latin American, and Latina feminisms. I'll talk about that a bit in today's presentation, but if you want to hear more about that, again, I'm happy to address it in the Q&A. Okay, so in a longer version of this presentation, I talk a little bit more about why I think that philosophers should care about this question of what a border is. I won't spend time talking about that today, but I have a lot to say about it, and that's just another thing that I would be delighted to talk about in the Q&A. But now I want to turn to the problem, certain challenges for understanding borders as sites of privacy violation. Now, you might think kind of just intuitively, oh, it should be pretty easy to think about borders in terms of privacy, right? Everyone talks about how borders, particularly borders like the U.S. Mexico border, are these sites of mass surveillance. So surely the privacy ethics literature and philosophy will give us all kinds of helpful tools for talking about why that's wrong. Well, I kind of counter that supposition by saying that actually the way in which the philosophical literature on privacy is laid out makes it kind of hard for us to use it for the purpose of kind of diagnosing ethical challenges in the realm of privacy occurring at borders. I think that we can fix it. I'll talk about that today, but it's not kind of an immediate, easy fix. So let me first talk a little bit about one of these problems, namely that privacy violations in the relevant literature tend to be viewed as one-off and interpersonal. So let me give an example from Judith Jarvis Thompson, The Eavesdropping Pedestrian. As you can see, I have a stock photo here of someone eavesdropping. I wasted lots of time looking at stock photos of eavesdroppers online. It was actually pretty fun. I invite you to do that if you're looking for a way to procrastinate on something. But in Judith Jarvis Thompson's kind of famous argument in which she's critically interrogating this idea of a right to privacy, the example that she gives is that of an eavesdropping pedestrian. Let's imagine the following. You are walking along and you're walking down the street and you approach an apartment building. And up on the second floor, there is a couple and they are having a fight. Now, in one variation of this challenge, the couple has left their window wide open, right? They are not taking any steps to muffle their sound, and they are just having this argument. And so imagine that you're walking along, but you're kind of curious about what they're fighting about. And so you kind of slow down a little bit and you eavesdrop, right? So in this case, Thompson asked, the case in which the window is left wide open, have you wrongfully violated their privacy? In another variation of the problem, right? Imagine that the couple, they've, they've closed the window and they're angry, but they're trying to muffle their sound, and that's obvious to you. But again, you walk down the street and you eavesdrop on their conversation. Is that a wrongful, a kind of violation of their privacy? But kind of these are classic examples of privacy violation that come up in the literature. Another that I'll just briefly talk about, Julie Innes, the example of the extremely talkative friend, right? Imagine that you have a friend who just, loves to talk, likes to share information about their friends. And in one variation, right, your friend tells someone else where your car happens to be parked, right? Maybe that's innocent. But in another example, your friend is sharing with others maybe details that you shared about your love life, right? About your intimate life. Is that a wrongful privacy violation? So I'm not going to kind of take a stand on either of these challenges. I'd be interested in hearing what you think counts as a wrongful privacy violation on an interpersonal level. But I raise these examples to demonstrate a challenge for thinking about privacy ethics at the border. Privacy violations at borders don't really work this way. It's not like an eavesdropping pedestrian or an extremely talkative friend, right? The kinds of borders that we're really concerned about often feature surveillance, again, on a very massive scale. And there are lots of different agents and even kind of non-human animals and machinery that's being used to surveil people and possibly to violate their privacy. So this kind of precedent that's been set in the literature, these kinds of ethical challenges aren't as helpful as one would hope. So that's one challenge. Here's another challenge coming from the philosopher Cecil Faber, who has a forthcoming book on the ethics of espionage. And if you are someone who loves kind of ethics and political philosophy, and you also love spy films, I recommend this book. But Faber in this book gives a kind of Robinson Crusoe-esque thought experiment. So imagine in this thought experiment that there's a man and he is trapped on a desert island, right? A shipwreck, he's washed up on this desert island. And this is a desert island that has been abandoned due to climate change. And on this island, there are many CCTV cameras set up all around the island, and they're operating. And the man sees those CCTV cameras. But in this kind of thought experiment that Faber presents us with, no one is looking at the footage of these cameras from this abandoned island. And no one ever will look at the footage on these cameras. All right, so that's the thought experiment. And Faber goes on to argue that, let me see, excuse me for a moment. The shipwrecked person would not have enjoyed more privacy if he had shipwrecked himself on a CCTV-free island, adding that one cannot lose privacy vis-a-vis a machine any more than one can lose it vis-a-vis one's watchful dog. I always wonder, I would like people to tell me, if you have pets, I don't have pets, right? But if you have dogs or cats, do you think that your dogs and cats can invade your privacy? But Faber says no. And here, this is kind of one kind of technical bit that I'm going to include today. I will not be inundating you with long technical quotes, but she argues that so she defines privacy, in terms of informational privacy, and argues, and I invite you to read along with me. X enjoys informational privacy vis-a-vis some third party Y at time T, just if Y either does not have access to information about X at T, or has access to it, but does not avail herself of it at T. Such information includes information that is sensitive, intimate, and personal, typically about her health, her sexual life, her most personal relationships, her moral and political commitments, and her daily movements, hobbies, shopping habits, and occasional encounters. So as you can see, right, this kind of invasion isn't happening to the man who's stranded on a desert island. He's not losing his informational privacy. And so you might say, okay, well, this kind of makes it hard to think about privacy invasions occurring at borders, right? Because again, borders are these sites in which there's lots of machinery and mass surveillance, right? And animals and the types of things that we don't necessarily think violate privacy. And so how might we reply to Faber with this challenge in mind? We might want to say, okay, privacy is invaded at borders, but the privacy violations are limited to humans at borders, right? So the cameras at borders are not invading privacy. The border walls are not invading privacy. The kind of the guard dogs that might be employed, right, just to search and surveil people are not violating privacy. It's just the human immigration agents that work at borders that are violating people's privacy. I think I have some worries about this kind of reply. This response would be out of line with Gloria Anzaldúa's influential account of the U.S. Mexico border as, in her words, a dividing line, a narrow strip along a steep edge, traps around the riverbeds beneath a bridge. And in terms of her haunting statement, this is her home, this thin edge of barbed wire. So, obviously, I engage Latina and Chicana feminism in this work, and I want my conclusions to kind of mesh with a lot of the central insights of that literature. But I'm not saying that, we should that it's simply because Gloria Anzaldúa said this, that Faber has to be wrong. What I extract from Anzaldúa's discussion here is this idea that for many vulnerable border crossers, it's not just the human immigration agents themselves that seem to be wrongfully violating privacy. It's something about material borders that constitute a type of invasion, right? The dividing line, the traps around the riverbeds, right? The barbed wire. So I think that response to Faber would be inadequate. Another possible reply, and this is what I think would be the right kind of reply, is that we need a broadened conception of privacy. And in my view, a broadened feminist conception of privacy. So a broadened feminist conception of privacy should have three different components. First of all, it should cover informational privacy. We just talked about that in the discussion of Faber, right? You likely do not enjoy informational privacy over your name, right? If people know your name. But if people don't know what your email password is, then you have informational privacy over your email password. It should include discussion of physical privacy as well, right? So physical privacy refers to privacy over your body. So if your body is not accessible to others via their senses or their surveillance devices, then you enjoy physical privacy, which is why for many, the home, for some people, right, the home is kind of the quintessential site of privacy and physical privacy in particular. The last component of privacy that I'll focus on, this is really important for feminist conceptions of privacy, is decisional privacy. So decisional privacy is important for many feminist privacy advocates. It's been very important in terms of defending Roe v. Wade, right? Roe v. Wade in the United States has been defended in terms of decisional privacy. Julie Innes has defined decisional privacy in terms of freedom to make certain decisions about oneself and things like contraceptives, sexuality, abortion, and child rearing. Anita Allen clarifies that while the notions of liberty and privacy are generally speaking conceptually distinct, quote, the concept of decisional privacy has closer conceptual affinities to liberty than to paradigmatic senses of privacy. But it also serves to protect these paradigmatic aspects of privacy. And kind of pulling together all of these strands of privacy that I argue are really important on this broadened feminist conception of privacy that we need to respond to Faber's challenge, Innes argues that privacy involves an agent controlling the information about her love letters, as well as who accesses her through a kiss. Privacy provides an agent with control over visual access to her naked body, as well as her decisions about contraceptives. Right? This is the entire package of privacy. And this brings us to another question. What is privacy's value? So this is privacy, right? It's all of these things, according to Innes, the conception that I advocate. But why should we care about privacy? Why is it valuable to us? Well, privacy protects intimate information, intimate access, and intimate decisions. So Innes explains that the value of privacy stems from a modified principle of respect for persons, which entails respect for them as beings with the capacity for love, care, and liking, as well as rationality. And she adds that we value privacy because it embodies our respect for persons as autonomous, loving, caring, and liking beings. And she further explains that privacy claims, quote, are claims to possess autonomy with respect to the expression of love, liking, and care. So that's one piece of privacy's value. The other is that privacy also protects personal autonomy, right? We already heard references to autonomy in the Innes discussion. But Anita Allen has explained that without privacy, individuals have a severely diminished capacity to live as individuated persons and equal participants in the good family and the just society. And that in order to be self-determining individuals, we need self-reflection, self-expression, and self-enjoyment, self-development, and rejuvenation, which are generic forms of activity fostered by privacy. So that's the kind of the big picture. This is the account of privacy, the feminist account of privacy that I think that we need to take seriously some of the gender injustices that are occurring at borders, including in Ukraine, but I'm going to talk about some additional examples in just a moment. So now I'm going to argue that borders are sites of unjust privacy violation. And let's begin by kind of going back to Faber's thought experiment, right? The Robinson Crusoe thought experiment. Let me get a drink of water. So I want you to imagine now, we have in mind this conception of privacy. Imagine now that the man in this thought experiment is shipwrecked with his immediate family, and that these family members are also members of an ethno-racial group that has been subjected to extreme levels of surveillance through CCTV cameras and other surveillance technologies. They have been surveilled as part of a systematic effort to demean the ethno-racial group in question, and the surveillance efforts have been linked to acts of physical violence against some of the group's members. Imagine now that the shipwrecked family arrives on an island filled with the same model of CCTV cameras that have been used to oppress members of their ethno-racial group. Now, I grant along with Faber that in this thought experiment, the family does not lose informational privacy, right? Because no one is looking at the camera footage. However, the family is very likely, I argue, to endure the following privacy losses. First of all, the feeling of being constantly surveilled may have a negative impact on their ability to engage in self-reflection, self-expression, self-development, and rejuvenation. The CCTV cameras may also undermine their claims to possess autonomy with respect to the expression of love, liking, and care. Apart from denying family members the experience of solitude, one can imagine that the cameras would thwart efforts to achieve sexual intimacy and familial intimacy. The family members may feel they have to perform their actions in socially acceptable ways for the camera, rather than defining and experiencing those interactions in terms of their love, liking, and care. And this is all possible, I submit, even though no one has physical or informational access to the family. And I think that a feminist conception of privacy that emphasizes decisional privacy enables us to see why. And I want to take this one step further. I want to argue that I think that the family endures a wrongful privacy loss, even if they know that no one is ever going to see the footage from those CCTV cameras. A couple of studies help show us why. One is from a group of anthropologists, Victor Talavera et al., who did a study. This was in El Paso, Texas, at the U.S. Mexico border, a study of previously legally undocumented Mexicans and Mexican Americans who had since seen their immigration statuses regularized. So that they had become, they had achieved legal permission to be in the United States. And in their ethnographic research, they found that many of the people that they interviewed under these circumstances still experienced heightened rates of fear in their encounters with immigration enforcement, even though they knew that they were not vulnerable to deportation in the same way. Many of them reported fear of just moving about freely on the streets, even though they had achieved so-called legal status to be in the United States. Another example comes from Anita Allen's work on gender and privacy. She cites some studies of women who have had experiences being sexually harassed by men. And in some of these studies, they show that the women in question later go on to endure what we might describe as privacy losses in their interactions with men that they know on a rational level are not sexually harassing them, right? Because there's this lingering trauma. So again, I say this to submit again that even if no one is looking at the footage of these cameras, I believe that the family in question is likely to endure a wrongful privacy loss. Okay, so I'm going to start wrapping the pieces of this up together and talk about how I think this can help us understand underexplored aspects of gender and migration. But first, let me just ask, are any privacy losses at borders morally permissible? I'm going to assume here, I'm not going to assume an open borders framework here. I'm happy to talk about why in the Q&A, but let's just assume that we have a world that's divided into some form of borders and bordering practices. And of course, this is not the same as accepting the status quo in migration. So under these circumstances, are any privacy losses at borders morally permissible? Well, you might say, okay, border agents have at least a prima facie right to request passports with identifying information. Maybe under certain circumstances, this is wrongful. I actually think that is in fact the case. But for many people, right, who are crossing borders, when you have to show your passport to an immigration agent, it's annoying, perhaps it involves a privacy loss, but it's not always a wrongful privacy loss. We might also say, look, border agents have a prima facie right to search one's belongings for illegal items. Again, prima facie, because this can be conducted in unjust ways, especially if there's racial profiling involved, right? But you might say, look, under some circumstances, searching, looking at the contents of one's suitcase, right, for illegal items can be morally acceptable. You might say, okay, if your picture gets taken at the border, that's not necessarily an unjust privacy loss. So I want to say, look, I'm not denying to states in this presentation the right to request certain forms of information at borders, and perhaps even the right to invade privacy in certain forms at borders. But now I want to contrast this to show why the conception of privacy I've just outlined, I think, can help us deliver some really important ethical results when we're talking about gender and immigration justice. Let's contrast this to the border crossing experiences of relatively vulnerable social groups. So now we're just going to read through some facts, and then I'll kind of wrap this up and bring it all together. First, let's talk about pregnancy. Border crossing for the purposes of prenatal care, childbirth, and abortion care are extremely common on a global scale. Sometimes this is due to a lack of access to prenatal and abortion care in one's region. For instance, it is estimated that approximately half of U.S. counties in rural areas are so-called maternity care deserts, which forces pregnant people to travel long distances for prenatal care and contributes to high rates of maternal mortality. It was recently reported that in New Mexico, 1 in 3 people who die either during childbirth or immediately after are killed as a result of car accidents. Each year, thousands of pregnant people give birth in the US on tourist visas, and they are frequently subjected to racist and sexist attitudes by immigration enforcement officials in their efforts to cross borders while pregnant. For instance, pregnant border crossers with legal permission to enter the US may be compelled to prove that they are not liable to become a public charge, which would give immigration agents power to deny them entry. And in recent research, I explored how many pregnant women entering the US from Mexico with legal authorization often feel compelled to perform middle-class identity in order to avoid being derided as so-called illegals and to avoid seeing their children derided as so-called anchor babies. Okay, it's a bit about pregnancy. Now some facts about miscarriage orders. So this is really underexplored, but many pregnant people also miscarry during their migrant journeys or in the immediate aftermath. Between 2017 and 2019, nearly 30 women experienced miscarriages while in ICE detention centers. Furthermore, in 2020, the European Advocacy Network, United for Intercultural Action, documented 46 drownings of pregnant migrants in the Mediterranean since 2014, but this number is expected to be vastly higher because there's really no official count or monitoring. A 40-year-old Afghan refugee named Bibi Gol, who is now living in Athens, was interviewed for Women Under Siege about her experience crossing the Eastern Mediterranean route with her husband and 4 children while she was 4 months pregnant. I'll invite you to kind of read a quote from her along with me. She said, "I wish I could forget about the crossing. It's something I don't ever want to think about again. The Turkish police did not want us to get to Greece. They harassed us, and on our second attempt, they even started to beat up all the women and children with a fishing rod." In 2016, I interviewed an El Paso-based OBGYN who shared the story of a legally undocumented patient who miscarried and almost died while crossing the U.S. Mexico border without legal authorization. And then I'll say a few of the quotes that I'm about to share are quite intimate and also graphic. And I want to issue that as maybe a trigger warning if you'd like to turn off your sound for a few minutes, but I'll proceed. He said in the interview, and I invite you to read with me, "I almost lost the patient. She was pregnant, but she came across and she tried to outrun the border patrol and she jumped over a barbed wire fence, filleted her, all her genitals, and almost bled out. Yeah, I was in the hospital putting her back together." So clearly material borders and the police and the agents who police them frequently pose grave threats to many migrants' pregnancies. Okay, so now I'm going to talk briefly about abortion and abortion migration. Legal restrictions on abortion on a global scale frequently compel pregnant people to cross state and national borders to access the healthcare they need. The Guttmacher Institute reported in 2014 that 90% of US counties lacked an abortion clinic, and the numbers are likely much worse now. Excuse me. So furthermore, 5 US states had only 1 in the entire state. In that same year, it was reported that the majority of reproductively aged women in the US live in states that can be characterized as hostile to abortion rights. Globally, it was reported in 2017 that nearly half of the world's reproductively aged women live in one of the 125 countries in which abortions are either illegal in all cases or permitted only when the pregnant person's health is at risk. So in 2017, I conducted field work at 2 abortion clinics in Albuquerque, New Mexico. Albuquerque is the place of work of 2 of only 4 physicians in the United States who regularly practice 3rd trimester abortions, which are usually requested by pregnant people under very, very challenging conditions. This is a photo of a protester outside of the clinic where I conducted field work. During that period, a Canadian woman narrated to me in the context of an ethnographic interview the anxiety and alienation she experienced while crossing the US-Canada border for a 3rd trimester abortion for what she called a wanted pregnancy due to a serious fetal indication. And I'm gonna invite you to read with me the transcript of her interview, which was in fact very informative to me and inspiring in terms of wanting to think critically and philosophically about borders from a feminist perspective. So she said to me in this interview, I was worried because they could ask you, what's the purpose of this travel? Why are you traveling there? And I called the hospital in Toronto and asked, can you please give me some paperwork? And they said, no, it should be fine. Just take your Canadian passport. I called the Albuquerque abortion clinic and I talked with the nurse. I said, can you please tell me what I should tell the people at the border? And she said, it's okay, Canadian passport is fine, but don't say anything about the clinic. Don't say anything about the abortion. So I was worried, what if people find out at the border that I'm going for an abortion and they try to stop me? And after that, because I knew this clinic would do the abortion up to 28 weeks, and I thought, what if I passed that week? What would happen to me? What would happen to this baby? She provided further details about the anxiety stemming from crossing a national border for abortion care. And I invite you to read this final part of her interview with me. I was so worried the night before we traveled. I couldn't sleep at all, not because of the procedure. That was my second problem. My first problem was passing the border. Our flight was at 7 a.m., but I was there with my brother at 2:30 a.m. Some crazy thinking came to my mind. What would happen if the officer stopped me from crossing the border? So we met the officer and he was really suspicious and he said, why are you traveling? And I said, it's personal. And you can't just say it's personal to an American officer. So he actually repeated a few times, what's the reason? And I kept saying personal. And then he finally said, go. And I was so relieved. So the flight came and I'm so fortunate that he let us pass the border because the hospital said if he really insisted to just say medical reason, but I really didn't want to go with that because probably he would say, you don't have good doctors in Canada. Is it a heart problem? So I didn't really want to explain the situation. And I was teasing my husband about that because we lost the point of the main concern here, that we are ending a life because we are so concentrated on the officers and crossing the border. Okay, so now the final little set of facts that I'll share before I wrap this all up connect to child migration. So child migration, including migration by unaccompanied minors, has been steadily on the rise over the past decades. It was reported that between 2011 and 2014, the number of unaccompanied children seeking asylum in Europe, the majority of whom were traveling from Afghanistan, Syria, Eritrea, and Somalia, doubled from around 12,000 to around 23,000. Meanwhile, in 2015, nearly 52,000 unaccompanied children from El Salvador, Guatemala, and Honduras were apprehended by the Border Patrol. In 2020, more than 328,000 people were expelled from the U.S. to Central America and Mexico, and this number included at least 13,000 unaccompanied children. Furthermore, between 2017 and 2018, in a practice that the American Academy of Pediatrics has described as government-sanctioned child abuse, more than 5,000 children with irregular immigration statuses in the US were forcibly separated from their parents with similar statuses without being provided with any information about their whereabouts. And what is perhaps one of the most horrifying examples of such a separation, an infant was physically ripped from his Honduran mother's arms while they were physically engaged in the act of nursing or breastfeeding, and he was then taken away from her. Today, around 1,000 children remain separated from their parents. Researchers have found that nearly all separated children and parents now meet the criteria for psychiatric diagnosis, including PTSD, separation anxiety among children, and major depression. In a rare interview with a teenager who had been separated from his mother at the U.S. Mexico border and his mother after they were reunited, CNN reported the following. I invite you to read the content of this interview with me. The boy who was separated, named Alejandro, said, "It hurt me so much because my mom was the only thing I had. I was completely alone," Alejandro said. "My mom, the person who supported me since I was little, she's always been by my side. I didn't have any other support, nothing more than my family and my mom." And CNN goes on to report that while many kids his age are embarrassed by their moms or want to assert their independence, Alejandro now clings to his mother like a toddler. He says, I wish I could be with my mom 24 hours a day, he said. I want to have her near me always. Sometimes my mom jokes with me. You still sleep with me? Aren't you embarrassed? And Dalia, his mom, says she doesn't mind her son curling up next to her or trailing her everywhere she goes. He says he does not feel safe sleeping alone, Dalia says. He doesn't want to leave my side because he thinks that they're going to separate us again. Okay, so that ends some of the important facts that I think that we ought to bear in mind in considering borders from a privacy ethics perspective. And so now let me wrap this up. Why did these experiences, in my view, constitute unjust privacy violations given the feminist conception of privacy that we spend time articulating? Well, first of all, they undermine autonomy. They undermine the capacity of individuals to, in Anita Allen's words, live as individuated persons and equal participants in the good family and the just society. Relatedly, both during and after the border crossings in question, many borders served to deprive vulnerable border crossers of opportunities for self-reflection, self-expression, self-enjoyment, self-development, and rejuvenation. Take, for instance, that interview that we just read with Alejandro, a teenager, and his mother, Dalia, who were separated at the border. Alejandro feels he cannot physically separate from his mother out of fear that she will be taken from him again. Indeed, he was described as clinging to his mother like a toddler. And meanwhile, other separated parents and children are now experiencing profound trauma and separation anxiety and PTSD. It is reasonable to suspect that such experiences could deprive them of opportunities for self-reflection, rejuvenation, and individuation. It is difficult, at the very least, for a young person to become an individuated person and a full participant in the good family and the just society if, in virtue of their border crossing, they are unable to separate physically, emotionally, and comfortably from their caregivers. Furthermore, while miscarriage is underexplored in migration studies and migration policy, it is reasonable to assume that many pregnant people who miscarry while crossing borders suffer similar traumas and with similar results. Recall Bibi Gold's claim that she wishes she could forget her experience of miscarrying at a national border, but finds that she cannot. And her narrative brings to mind kind of certain insights from feminist bioethics literature of how a miscarriage under certain conditions can undermine the kind of self-trust one needs to be autonomous. If border crossers who miscarry like Gold feel haunted by their border crossing experiences, it may be difficult for them to subsequently enjoy the kind of self-actualizing solitude that Anita Allen and Hannah Arendt have described as essential to our very personhood. And this brings us to another sense in which these experiences constitute unjust privacy violations, namely undermining personhoods. I submit that many borders fail to respect persons, particularly vulnerable people like women, pregnant people, and children, as autonomous, loving, caring, and liking beings. They frequently deny people the opportunity to experience intimacy, understood again in terms of defining, living, and comprehending crucial personal matters in terms of one's own love, liking, and care. For example, I mentioned how pregnant Mexican border crossers are often forced to perform middle-class identity and even risk their health when crossing borders with reasonable fear of being denied entry, reasonable fear of being viewed as so-called illegals and seeing their children derided as anchor babies. In such cases, the border becomes an intrusion on one's intimate experiences of pregnancy and child rearing in ways that can produce ongoing trauma for parents and children alike. Also, we discussed how thousands of children and parents were forcibly separated from one another at the U.S. Mexico border. All parties were denied the ability literally to be together as a family and in turn to maintain familial intimacy under already arduous conditions. Autonomy in the realm of intimacy is also denied when the crossing of material borders compels pregnant women to miscarry. In these cases, unjust privacy losses are suffered when pregnant people are denied by borders the opportunity to carry their pregnancies to term and to become parents if they so desire. And lastly, being interrogated at borders about intimate matters like family planning can also fail to respect border crossers as autonomous persons in the realm of love, liking, and care. We saw that Sarah explained that her justified fear of crossing the US-Canada border and all the obstacles this entailed deprived her of the opportunity to intently focus on the fact that she was about to terminate the life of what she described as a wanted pregnancy. So in this case, instead of understanding, experiencing, and defining her abortion in terms of her love, liking, and care, she had to imagine how her pregnant border crossing would be perceived by an immigration officer who might be hostile to abortion rights. And she lamented this. And so this brings me to my conclusion, thinking about kind of a feminist theory of borders. So just to say a few words about this, as many feminist scholars have pointed out, when we think about kind of public realm institutions like borders, right? Borders are in many respects public realm institutions. We often fail to think about oppression in the private realm and the relationship between public realm oppressions and private realm oppressions. We lack a language for thinking about public institutions like borders in terms of intimacy and privacy. And what I hope to have maybe at least partially convinced you of today is that we need to think about borders in terms of intimate harm, in terms of privacy violation. We need a new language for understanding borders in order to render visible kind of the kinds of injustices that many vulnerable border crossers experience. And I focused on some of them in today's presentation. And so I will leave it at that, and I'm looking forward to any questions that you might have. And once again, thank you so much for listening. And yes, I look forward to your comments and questions.
Thanks so much, Dr. Reed-Sandoval, for the fantastic talk, engaging and really rich on a number of levels. Thank you so much. And we do have several questions in the queue already, and folks, feel free to put more questions in the queue there as we go forward too. But just to get to it, so Dr. Reed-Sandoval, the first question, and apologies for mispronunciation of the name here possibly, but Jaquia, and Jaquia writes, this is kind of about the motivations of your project. What made you want to write about these border experiences? Do you know someone or persons personally who have suffered from an experience crossing a border? And what do you hope your book will do to bring awareness to these experiences?
Thank you so much, Jaquia, for that question. Yeah, so my interest in these topics came about kind of in two ways. First of all, in my first book that Michael mentioned, Socially Undocumented Identity and Immigration Justice, I devoted one chapter to thinking. So when I talk about being socially undocumented in that book, I talk about what it means to have someone just assume by kind of looking at you that you are in the United States without legal authorization, right? Just kind of people think it's kind of, so I argue that it's kind of, it's a racialized and a class-based identity and a sorts of injustice. And so I devoted one chapter of that book to thinking about what it means for socially undocumented identity to kind of intersect with the embodied experiences of pregnancy. I talked a little bit about that research today. And so one reason that I wanted to keep writing about this is because that chapter, which I almost considered not including in the book for reasons like pertaining to the review process, it's really been the chapter that inspired the most questions in response to my book. A lot of people want to focus on that in that chapter, and I could see, there's really something about crossing borders while pregnant, maternity and migration that's raising philosophical challenges for people. So that was one reason. The other reason was when I was doing this field work in Albuquerque, New Mexico at 2 abortion clinics, and I was interviewing women and pregnant people who had traveled long distances and crossed the borders for abortion care. I had originally conceived of it as a bioethics project, but I realized, we really need to develop a political theory that can help us talk about these experiences, because I don't think that people really understand just how grave gender injustice is in the realm of migration and the ethics of borders. And so they're kind of those experiences that inspired me to keep asking these questions and try to build up a political theory so that we can talk about this. And in terms of what I hope to accomplish, I hope that people develop a stronger sense of many of the injustices that are transpiring in migration and at borders that just don't get a lot of airtime. I don't think that we yet have a language for understanding them. And I want to generate something of a language to be able to talk about this. And of course, then to do something about these injustices? Thank you so much for those questions.
So just to follow up on this question comes from an anonymous attendee, and it's asking, think about your ethnographic work at the abortion clinics you mentioned, your group women and children in your interviews. And there's just, how did that impact you? How did you feel when you were interviewing these women and children? What was that like for you?
Yes, thank you so much for that question as well. It was incredibly eye-opening. I had been involved in kind of reproductive rights activism for all of my adult life. And I confess that I really had no idea on the one hand just how bad things were. On the other hand, I was just incredibly moved and impressed by the bravery of many of the women who, again, given that there are so few abortion providers that are doing work in the third trimester of pregnancy, I talked with women who had traveled from New Zealand, from Europe, right, from Canada, from different parts of Latin America, right? And then imagine you travel all of that way and you arrive at a clinic where there are throngs of anti-abortion protesters who are just, saying, really sexist and demeaning things to them and frightening them. But nevertheless, they had such a strong sense of why they needed abortion care and why it was right for them. And they were able to, talk about it. The bravery of the patients themselves, the bravery of the doctors, and also, just the fact that there was a certain kind of political philosophy and ethics, being talked about right in that space itself. And so that really impacted, it humbled me and it impacted me. And it also made me realize that I think it's really important for a lot of us philosophers, to get out into the real world and have these experiences. Because when I turn back to a lot of the standard philosophical literature on abortion, right, the ethics of abortion literature that we teach in class, it seemed kind of just so distanced from the ways in which we tend to talk about abortion ethics in the classroom. It was not, I don't want to say it was laughable, but it was pretty stark. And I thought, if we want to have, if we as philosophers want to have any hope for really making a change in the world, to harken back to Jaquia's question, we actually have to get out there and see how the world works and learn from people, some of the world's most vulnerable people who are able and willing to speak about their experiences and teach philosophers and academics about their experiences, and of course to philosophize themselves. Thank you for that question.
So Dr. Reed-Sandoval, this next question comes from Dr. Nate Olson. And he notes, thank you for this wonderful talk. I'm wondering if you could say more about how power differentials fit into the three components of your definition of privacy. As your examples show, you don't have privacy if a person has power to infringe your privacy, but does not. For instance, they can watch surveillance video, but they do not, or could search you, but they choose not to do so. So are more equal power distributions required to have privacy?
Thank you very much for that question. I really love the way that you're phrasing that, because absolutely, yes, at the heart of this are differences of power, right? Kind of state power, right, versus the power of individuals to cross borders, or their lack of power. Even in terms of privacy in the home, right? Often it's, within a home unit, this has been the focus of attention for feminist philosophers, right? The people in the home who have kind of the least power tend to enjoy less privacy than those who are more empowered in the home. And so I really appreciate how, yes, kind of talking about this in terms of a power differential. And yeah, I think that I wish I'm going to think more about this, but I absolutely believe that addressing the privacy, I suspect that a necessary step for addressing kind of the privacy invasion in question is attending to that power imbalance, right? Because again, even if kind of this idea, even if someone merely kind of has the power to spy on you, I think kind of knowing that or kind of being aware of that can maybe cause a kind of privacy violation, even if someone chooses to not use that power. So yes, thank you very much for that point. I'm going to think more about that, but it's a very helpful way of articulating how we have to address the problem.
Thanks. So many great questions coming through. So thanks to our audience for engaging so well here. This question is from an anonymous attendee, and they said, this is a question that popped into my mind. They say, are privacy losses at borders morally permissible if it is in regards to the safety of others?
Thank you. I mean, so that's a great question. I certainly think that that's an important consideration, right? I think that we can all, many of us, we can probably think about examples of cases of which, even in the name of safety, we want to say that certain forms of privacy loss are still wrong. But I absolutely, but I do think that kind of safety concerns are important, right? When we're thinking about, cases in which privacy can kind of rightfully be invaded, right? So if we think, okay, we're fine with, having someone in a fair and egalitarian manner, searching everyone's belongings as long as it's conducted respectfully and everyone is getting the same type of search, right? There's not a hierarchy in place, there's no racial profiling, et cetera. I think that we would say yes, in the name of safety, that can be a case in which privacy can be invaded, and perhaps rightfully so. But of course, as we all know, these kinds of safety arguments can be abused, and so we want to be really careful about it. But I certainly think that that's something to bear in mind, and it's Anita Allen talks about, right? In the public realm, we have to just accept that we enjoy less privacy, right? This is just a fact of being on the street, right? Things can happen to you when you're out in public that don't happen to you in the home. And so we have to have careful conversations about what kinds of privacy invasions we're willing to accept and seem to be morally acceptable, and why, right? And then the kinds of privacy violations that really do seem to cross a line. So that was a long-winded answer to your question, but yes, I think that safety is definitely a concern to bear in mind.
Thank you. So this next question comes from Dr. Tiffany Sasulas, and she writes, thank you for an excellent talk. I'm curious why privacy as the lens for this work? Are there other frameworks you use in addition to privacy to form this feminist theory of the border?
Thank you. Yes, a great question. I will say that I'm also very interested in intimacy, and in fact, I was initially using rather exclusively the language of intimacy to talk about this. But some of the most interesting work that I found, kind of feminist work on intimacy, does connect it to privacy and the right to privacy, and so I kind of like that package. But I think that one of the reasons that I have chosen to pursue this is specifically because so many feminists have objected to the fact that in political philosophy, in politics, we're just not focusing on the private and the intimate. And so these do seem to be kind of intimate harms and privacy violations that are occurring for many of the people that I discuss in the paper. So I found it to be a helpful framework. But I'll say that I certainly don't think that this is, and I'll also say my work is influenced by Gloria Anzaldúa, who talks about her experiences growing up in the U.S. Mexico borderlands. She called it a type of intimate terrorism. Like she uses the language of intimate terrorism. And so that was also part of what inspired me to pursue this particular path. But I'll say, I don't think that this is the only language for talking about these kinds of violations, right? Philosophers have focused on things like, equality, right? Liberty, autonomy, right? There are different kind of ethical systems that we can employ to talk about different sorts of injustices. But I think that there's really something to be made of the language of privacy and intimacy, but this is just a start, right? There's so much feminist work that needs to be done in this area. And so I'm very open to the suggestion that additional ethical frameworks can be employed for this purpose.
So this question comes from Dr. Joseph Flores. To what extent do you consider questions of privacy that arise from migrant women before actually crossing borders? In particular, I'm thinking about informal actors like narcotraficantes that pose serious threats to women as they make the journey. To what extent do you consider that?
Yes, thank you. And Michael, the sound for some reason cut out for me kind of in the middle of this. So just to make sure I'm understanding correctly, is the idea that it's not just at borders themselves, right? It's part of the journey, like what's happening along the journey and along the way.
Yeah, I think that's the thrust of the question, is considering the questions of privacy that arise from migrant women before actually crossing the borders, including the example that Dr. Flores raised.
Thank you so much for that question, because that enables me to also just talk a little bit about where I see the book going, right? Because I absolutely do not want us to just be thinking about state borders, for example, or borders like kind of the Mexico-U.S. border. I think that that these kinds of violations are occurring over the course of migrant journeys, right? They're occurring, for example, I'm very open to the idea that anti-abortion protesters might be a form of border, right? Even the walls of one's home, right? For some people who have to work really hard to kind of get out of their house to get an abortion, right? The walls of their home might be a form of border. And so I appreciate, right? It's not, and there's a certain sense in which it's not just about borders, but I think that we need to really expand upon our understanding of what counts as a border to really diagnose the kind of the privacy invasions in question. And I see kind of interdisciplinary, kind of social scientific work on borders, working to define borders, as trying to expand how we think about borders to enable us to talk about these different types of migratory injustices. And so this is kind of part of the project that I'm still working on, but I'm kind of very open to this idea. And I think it's absolutely correct that it's not just like the moment you reach the Mexico-US border. I actually think that bordering practices are occurring, right? Unjust bordering practices are occurring from the moment in which kind of the migrant journey is initiated. So I absolutely agree with that, and I hope to be able to give a better answer to your question once I've written an ensuing chapter of the book. But thank you so much. I agree wholeheartedly.
So Dr. Reed-Sandoval, this question comes from Sonia. She writes, hi, Dr. Sandoval, thanks so much for your talk. You spoke about the effect that privacy loss has on people long after they cross borders, such as either through hypervigilant awareness of police or ICE or worry of being deported. Do you think that hypervigilance gets ingrained into the family dynamic and eventually turns into intergenerational traumas? Have you seen this phenomenon at all in your studies or your work?
Thank you very much for that question. Yes, absolutely. I think that there's this really important literature on the experiences of mixed status families, for example, that really focuses on this kind of intergenerational trauma. Including on the part of children who might have legal permission to be in the United States. They may have been born in the United States, right? But seeing as I refer to it, kind of the social illegalization of their parents, right, of their caregivers, that makes them internalize a certain sense of so-called immigrant illegality that comes to be embodied. And in fact, in my view, it's ingrained in a way that actually becomes its own kind of social identity, which I call being socially undocumented. And in my book, Socially Undocumented, I talk about how that operates as a social identity. And so, yes, and I'll also say this kind of connects to an earlier question. I had long wanted to say more about kind of the impact of social legalization on children. This is something that I wish I had spoken more about in my first book. And so I'm hoping that in thinking about kind of injustices at borders and borders themselves from a feminist framework, I'm hoping that will open doors to talk more about this problem. It's a really serious problem, and it's something that philosophers and others urgently need to work on in light of the abuses, kind of the child abuse that has occurred and continues to occur within our immigration system. But thank you so much for that question.
This question comes from Suzanne, and how could states take responsibility for the mental harm they cause by separating children from their parents, among other intrusions of intimate boundaries? So what would it look like for states to take responsibility for that?
Yes, thank you. This is such a hard, I would invite others have ideas about this, where I think that we really need to put our heads together. The problem of separated families is just so grandiose and so horrific that I think that we need to approach this from many different kind of disciplinary and policy angles. I think that there needs to be more political recognition of the problem. There's certainly been some of that, right? But more needs to happen with greater urgency. We need to be working on, reuniting separated families and compensating those who have suffered these abuses. But I also think, as long as families continue, as long as child abuse continues to occur within our immigration system, and as long as child migrants are mistreated, are treated unjustly within our immigration system, people who have suffered, children and families who have suffered these injustices, how are they really going to be able to recover when you just turn on the news and you see that variations of this continue to happen. And so I think that we need to amend these abuses in the immigration system and focus on children and families in immigration policy to give hope to separated families for a form of recovery. But that's the start of an answer. And again, this is a huge problem. And I think that we all really need to put our heads together to think about ways to address it.
Yeah, thanks, Dr. Reed-Sandoval, for tackling some really massive questions too. We appreciate you weighing in on them. None of them are easy to respond to. So Dr. Stephen Gamboa writes, have you considered whether the rhetoric of anchor babies has been used to specifically target pregnant women attempting to cross national borders? Have you seen that or considered that?
So as opposed to specifically targeting children, it's actually targeting the pregnant women, pregnant folks.
Specifically as a target for pregnant women attempting to cross national borders.
Yes. So absolutely. The philosopher Natalie Cisneros has a really interesting analysis of this and a piece that came out in Hypatia that I highly recommend. Yes, absolutely. I think so. Of course, Leo Chavez and others have talked about how this is traumatizing to children who are derided as anchor babies, but I certainly think that Cisneros' analysis shows that this is a targeting of the bodies of women of color and migrants of color, and it's starting right during pregnancy and before the children themselves are born. And so yes, a complete picture of this has to focus on the trauma endured by children, but also how it's a targeting, how it's a heightened illegalization of certain pregnant bodies. And I'll say I argue in Socially Undocumented that to be pregnant and socially undocumented is to be the most illegalized of all subjects in the United States. So I agree wholeheartedly with that statement. I talk a bit about it in the book. And also I think that Natalie Cisneros was a really good philosophical rendering of that problem. But I really appreciate the comment and question. Thank you very much.
So this next question comes from Jasmine. And she writes, what is the most difficult or maybe controversial challenge even to the analysis you presented? For example, regarding the example you provided of a woman who miscarried while crossing over a fence at the U.S. Mexico border, one can imagine an argument, even if misinformed, well, she put herself at risk by illegally crossing the border anyway. That kind of challenge, which we might hear from certain sectors of communities. How would you respond to challenges like that, given that they do arise?
Yeah, I mean, this is really important to be able to respond to these types of claims, right? If we shouldn't be seeing ourselves, we shouldn't just be positioning ourselves within those who are kind of sympathetic to the claims that we want to make. And so I think this is really important, right? How can we get out there and talk to different publics? This is a really relevant question. What I would likely reply, and do let me know if this is not a satisfactory reply, but I think that sometimes just to kind of use a term, I'll say kind of anti-immigrant folks, but the people that the argument that you described, perhaps someone could kind of make it from a different kind of position. I know that the person who raised the question wasn't speaking from an anti-immigrant position, right? But often have this idea that the right to have borders, right, is kind of it leads to a kind of anything goes scenario, right? And so it becomes in philosophy a debate between the so-called open borders people and the so-called kind of closed borders people. And the idea is like, well, if you don't want certain injustices to be occurring at borders, you have to advocate for an open borders position. I actually think that tends to be sloppy reasoning. And I would say to someone who wants to make this argument, like, look, the right of states, if we want to say that states have a presumptive right to have borders and control borders, that doesn't cancel out the rights of states to honor universal moral equality, right? And so the borders have to respect everyone as morally equal, right? And so if you want to have bordering practices, do them in a way that's consistent with this idea, this kind of central idea of justice, that everyone is morally equal. And I would further say that, look, if it's the case, which it is, that pregnant people and other vulnerable groups are systematically experiencing really degrading violations at borders. And if you're aware of this and you continue to uphold certain types of border policies that allow this to happen, then you're failing to uphold, to acknowledge universal moral equality, and your state then becomes unjust. So that's something that I do try. This is why I often want to say, like, look, you don't need to be an open borders advocate to really care about these issues. And I do that in part because I want folks who maybe have different, political persuasions and different views about immigration to be able to step back and really ask themselves kind of more difficult and critical questions about what the borders are actually doing, right? And so that would be my attempt at a reply, but I'd be interested to hear out what other folks would say in response to a challenge like that. It's a great question.
So we're getting close to the end of our time together tonight, but there's a question from Megan. The question, I need to interpret it a little bit, but I think what the thrust of the question is about is the distinction you made, Dr. Reed-Sandoval, about a privacy violation, even if someone isn't watching, right? Like, so say you're being filmed, but someone isn't watching it, or someone you're capable of being tracked, but no one's actually tracking you. And you say like there's some level maybe of privacy violation that's still happening there. So can you explain that a bit more and how that might differ from a privacy violation where someone actually is watching you, filming you and watching you?
Yes, thank you. You know what? I have not thought about this particular question along these lines, and it's really fascinating. Yes, I think that if we start by asking ourselves why we value privacy, what privacy does to us, and if we think about ways in which people can experience these sorts of privacy violations, even if no one's actively watching them, well, then of course I think it opens the door to conversations about why a violation is occurring even if there's no active observer. But I wonder, is that somehow not as bad as cases in which you do have an active observer? I think it's a brilliant question. I'm not quite ready to give what I consider to be my fully informed answer. I'm inclined to say that when we're thinking about the severity of the violation, I want to say maybe we should start by looking at its effects, the effects of the violation. And I am open to the possibility that maybe certain forms of violation that are occurring, even without an actual observer, might in fact be worse than violations in which there is an observer in question. But I acknowledge that I have not defended that claim, and it needs kind of a lot more work. And so I would love to get your name, because this is a really important question to think about. And well, I'd like to get the names of everyone who raised questions, because these have been so wonderful and helpful. But it's a very important challenge.
Thank you. And let's close with this final question here. So this comes from Veronica. This is an opening question for you, Dr. Reed-Sandoval. This is a current topic related to Ukraine, right? Having potentially 4 million people fleeing the country in the upcoming weeks and months. I know I saw today that there was 1 million that have been noted up to this point. What would this mean for the women and children in this situation? Like, you started out by talking about Ukraine. What are you reflecting on regarding the impact of this on women and children from Ukraine in this situation?
Thank you. Yes, a couple of different sorts of reply. I mean, again, this is a huge question, a rapidly kind of evolving situation. I think we need lots of different perspectives and discussion about this. The one thing that I'll say is that I think that borders are already being redrawn in Ukraine, right? And so going back to the surrogacy example, right? Being forced to kind of move from one's rural area to a city to give birth, and then to move to an area in which there's less hostility, less fighting. We're already seeing that for many pregnant women, pregnant folks, for children, new borders are already being drawn, even if they're not kind of officially recognized as state borders. Another thing that I'll say is that I would hope that thinking about intimacy and privacy and these wrongful kinds of intimacy and privacy violation that are occurring in Ukraine, I hope that it could enable us to have a more robust, a more nuanced ethical conversation about all the wrongs that are occurring on the ground, right? And so, and to not forget, right, the ways in which gender injustices in the realm of migration, including internal migration, are already actively occurring, right? And so we know, feminists that work on, just war theory, right, or work on kind of issues of war, have long pointed out that there are so many harms of war, occurring on the ground that just don't get attention, that don't get pointed out, right? And so I would hope that this kind of framework would enable us to talk about some of the injustices that are occurring and that are really wrong and really heartbreaking, but just aren't getting the same level of media attention.
Thank you so much, Dr. Reed-Sandoval, again, for your time tonight, for your lecture, and for your spending a precious amount of time answering questions too. And thanks to our audience so much for your questions and your engagements. It's really wonderful to see the level of engagement we get even in this virtual world. So I also want to invite people to follow us on social media to track our events, including an upcoming talk on March 15th with Dr. Jennifer Morton from UPenn on ethical challenges facing first-generation students, college students, which is very relevant, of course, for our university at CSUB, but also many universities around the country. But most importantly, again, Dr. Reed-Sandoval, thanks so much. Be well. Everybody else, stay safe, and we hope to see you again soon. Take care.
Yeah.